What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about how to practice using someone's new name and pronouns when they transition so that you can stop misgendering them and start affirming them as their true self. I'm back with another video in my series about misgendering, the consequences it has for trans and non-binary people, and how to avoid it. The usual disclaimer applies, which is that this video isn't about controlling what you say or limiting your free speech. Every trans person knows that we can't make anyone gender us correctly. This video is just about giving advice to those of you who want to respect your fellow human beings but maybe don't know how to go about that so well when it comes to trans and non-binary people, and you're looking to learn. So now let's talk about practicing names and pronouns. And I want to focus on a very specific kind of situation where someone you've already known for years comes out to you as trans. The longer you knew someone pre-transition, the harder it can be to shift to their new name and pronouns. It's very difficult to override all your brain's memories of how you used to perceive and address that person. So how do you make that shift successfully? Practice. Just like anything else in life, if you want to get good at using someone's new name and pronouns, you've got to practice them until they become second nature. And trans people do understand this, by the way. In fact, we have to practice gendering ourselves correctly, believe it or not. So we know you're going to slip up in the beginning, we know you have to practice to get it right, and we don't expect perfection. Where we tend to get frustrated is if you're still slipping up and we're still having to remind you long after we've come out, because that means you're not practicing, which implies that you don't care about us enough to be respectful. Most people who make a dedicated effort toward practicing will be gendering us correctly without slipping up or having to be reminded within a few months. So how do you get to that point? What does practicing entail, and how can you do it most effectively? Here are 5 tips. Number 1. Practice gendering your trans loved one correctly in different forms. That means in your head, in writing, both digitally and on paper, out loud, in sign language, whatever methods you might use to refer to that person. If you just practice in one form, like in your head only but not in conversation, that can make it harder to stick and you're more likely to slip up and misgender them more often. Practicing in your head is easiest because you can do it anywhere without anyone knowing. Practicing in writing is also pretty easy, and you can reinforce it by practicing with a pen and paper, in a Word file on your computer, in text messages to yourself or to mutual friends who are also practicing, etc. Practicing out loud or in sign language can be a little more challenging, especially if you're always around people your trans loved one isn't out to. But you can look for times when you're alone and out of sight and earshot of others, like in the shower or the car or your bedroom or elsewhere in your home if you live alone, and practice then. And if your trans loved one is out to anyone else, then y'all can practice together. Number 2. Every time you slip up, correct yourself and reinforce the correction. That means stopping as soon as you make a mistake and repeating your sentence with the correct gendered terms. For example, I saw her yesterday. It's really important to try and catch yourself when you slip up. That takes the burden off your trans loved one of always having to remind you. But if you don't manage to catch yourself and your trans loved one or a mutual friend does remind you, it's still helpful to do exactly the same thing. Repeat your sentence with the correct gendered terms. A lot of times people just say sorry when they're corrected or reminded, but they don't repeat the sentence with the correct gendered terms, which means they never reinforce those terms in their brain. So those kinds of slip-ups are more likely to happen again. Something else that can help with reinforcement is additional practice later. I've seen a lot of trans people recommend that for every time you slip up, you should later make up 3 sentences about your trans loved one where you use their correct name and pronouns. So if you said something in conversation like, "Girl, you look fabulous today," in the moment you could self-correct to, "Dude, you look fabulous today." And then after you go home, you could make up 3 sentences in your head to reinforce that further. For example, "Jason has been my best friend since we were 5. He's one of the most dapper guys I've ever met. He was rocking an epic tie this afternoon." Number 3. Don't just focus on name and pronouns, consider other forms of gendering too. Maybe you used to call that person your brother, but now you call them your sibling. Maybe you used to call that person your girlfriend, but now you call him your boyfriend. Maybe you used to call that person handsome, but now she'd rather be called pretty instead. You get the idea. I have another video about gendered language beyond name and pronouns if you want to check that out for more examples. A couple of other things to think about. One is what kinds of social activities you invite them to and whether those are gendered in a way that could either make them feel really affirmed or really uncomfortable. For example, a trans woman might feel over the moon to get invited to your girls' night out, but a trans man you used to invite before he transitioned will probably feel extremely dysphoric about it if you invite him now, even if you do so with good intentions, like trying to make sure he doesn't feel excluded. And the other is thinking about what kinds of gifts you give your trans loved one and what kinds of gendered connotations those might have. Trans people will probably feel dysphoric if you give them a gift that basically misgenders them, such as giving a trans woman men's cologne. Trans people might feel really affirmed by heavily gendered gifts that are correct for them, such as if you gave that men's cologne to a trans man instead, but it could also come across as patronizing rather than genuine. And it could just be awkward if your trans loved one is non-binary. A gender-neutral gift may feel like less of a risk and could be especially affirming for a non-binary person, but it could also just as easily be taken as a sign that you don't see your trans loved one as their real gender yet. Trans people are not a monolith, so tailor your gifts to your trans loved one and their personality the same way you would for anyone else. And if you're not sure how a gift might go over in light of their transition, it's always better to ask first than give them an unpleasant surprise. Also, it's a pretty safe bet that you shouldn't do something like give all the women at the party matching gifts and also plop one of those gifts in front of the one trans masked person there. Totally haven't been on the receiving end of that one. But yeah, even if the gift itself isn't gendered, making it part of a gendered group gift totally still counts as misgendering. So, bottom line, be mindful of all the ways that you gender your trans loved one aside from just using their name and pronouns, and correct yourself on those other things too whenever you slip up. Number 4. When you recall past memories with your trans loved one, use their current gender. This is the one that tends to trip people up the most when they're learning to make that switch. Because when they have past memories of that person pre-transition, they're more likely to use that person's old name and pronouns when recalling those memories. But if you do that, it could have some major negative consequences, like outing your loved one or revealing their dead name to people who didn't know it. And even if something like that doesn't happen, you could still hurt your trans loved one by making them feel like you think of their pre-transition self as their real self. So when you're practicing, one of the most effective ways to avoid this is to frame the past as before X transitioned, rather than back when X was still Y. Just like how you'd say before Mrs. X got married rather than saying back when she was still Miss Y. That lets your trans loved one's dead name stay dead, and it helps you acknowledge that they were always who they are now, it's just that no one knew it yet. Number 5. Be extremely careful about accidental outing. In the previous tip, I mentioned how if you talk about a past memory with your trans loved one and you use their old name and pronouns, that could out them. And that leads into this tip, which is that it's absolutely critical not to out your trans loved one while you're practicing their new name, pronouns, and other gendered terms. That means being careful about where and how you practice, especially if you're practicing out loud in any public place. Who might overhear you, and do they know your trans loved one, or know that your loved one is trans? It also means being careful in social situations where you talk about your trans loved one, especially if you're still early on in your practicing and you're more likely to make mistakes. What are the chances that those kinds of mistakes could out them? Avoiding accidental outing can be especially difficult if your trans loved one is out to you but is still closeted around others or maybe even everyone else in their life, because that means you'll be using their old name and pronouns in some situations to avoid outing them and their new name and pronouns in other situations to affirm them. And keeping all of that straight in your head can be not only difficult but frustrating, especially when you do keep having to use the old name and pronouns that you're trying so hard to unlearn. But please try not to burden your trans loved one with any of the frustration you might feel. They already know this is hard for you and they probably feel guilty about it. What can help is remembering that if you are in that position, it's because your trans loved one trusted you enough to share their truth with you. And not only that, they clearly trusted you more than all the other people they haven't told. So anytime you get frustrated about how hard it is to practice their new name and pronouns without outing them, think about how hard it also was for them to work up the courage to be their full self around you, and what a gift they've given you by letting you in. Alright, those are my 5 tips for how to practice gendering your trans loved one correctly when you knew them pre-transition. And before I wrap up, I want to leave you with one final point. Before you start practicing, it can be really helpful to have a conversation with your trans loved one around expectations, where you can address things like, do they want you to practice with them, or would they rather you practice on your own or with mutual friends who are practicing too? Some trans people might feel dysphoric about hearing your slip-ups even though they know those slip-ups are expected. Others might not care and would be happy to help you through those stumbles until you get it right. Do you have a learning disability, or memory issues, or a language barrier, or anything else that might make it more difficult for you to practice? If so, it's really helpful to share that with your trans loved one if you feel comfortable. That way, if you take longer to start gendering them correctly than most other people, they'll know you have a good reason for it instead of just thinking you don't care. Are there any situations where it's absolutely imperative that you don't slip up because doing so could out them and put them in danger? If so, you'll need a plan for how to navigate those situations during the time when you're still practicing and slipping up a lot. Do you avoid those situations altogether until you're consistently getting it right? Or do you just avoid talking about your trans loved one while you're there? Figure that out with them before you go into those situations so it doesn't catch you off guard and you don't make a costly mistake. And that is all the practicing advice I have, so now is where I'm going to turn the conversation over to you. If you're trans, what advice would you give for helping the people in your life practice gendering you correctly? If you've had a loved one come out to you as trans, how did you practice gendering them correctly, and what advice would you give based on that experience? If you're a trans person with a trans loved one whose new name and pronouns you've had to practice, what advice would you give from both sides of the coin? And whether you're trans or not, whether you have a trans loved one or not, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got a whole bunch of vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, including my series on misgendering. I've got cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. I hope your practicing goes well, and I will see you on the next one.